Hello, welcome back to another video. This week I finished another study from reference using mixed media. I talk about how I simplified my watercolor process and what I think about during the color pencil phase. Let's get started. The supplies I used include Arch's hot press watercolor paper, Faber-Castell's 12 set of Polychromos color pencils, Derwent Drawing Pencils in Olive Earth, Smoke Blue, and Light Sienna, the Derwent 6-pencil red set, a white Gellyroll Gel Pen, a Derwent pencil extender, a white POSCA acrylic paint pen, and the Daniel Smith Watercolor Essentials set. Like always, I started by transferring my sketch onto the Arch's paper using a light box and the Polychromos pencils. I like using Polychromos instead of graphite because they don't dissolve underwater, and I can use a variety of colors instead of just gray. After taping down the study, I started by blocking in the background, first with dirty paint water, and then the actual mixtures I pre-mixed for this layer. I prefer working wet on dry for control, but it's been so dry where I live that I need to add water first to prevent hard edges from forming before I can finish a layer. While the paper was still wet, I dropped in neutral brown and gray tones to let them softly diffuse and blend out. When I first started painting with watercolor back in December, letting paint flow the way it wanted to was uncomfortable for me. In my digital art, I have complete control of my strokes and how I blend edges, but watercolor requires you to let go of all of that. Even wet on dry layers can have granulation and texture you didn't plan to, like in her hair. At first, this frustrated me to no end. Many of my early studies involved vigorous scrubbing and lifting to try to even out the washes of color. I was initially dismayed when pure cotton paper also didn't create the flat washes I wanted, but I think this week I finally started accepting that this is just part of the learning process and a quirk of the medium. When parts of her shirt bled outside the lines or granulated, I let it dry without lifting. I did the same with her skin. I think this ultimately helped preserve the paper's texture and some of the initial luminosity watercolor is known for. The other thing I did differently was use fewer layers. Normally, I like to layer 5 to even 10 times to reach the depth and opacity I want, but I only used 3 layers for each part of the painting this time. In some areas, like the background, I only did 1 wet on wet layer. I resisted the urge to pile on more pigment on darker areas by reminding myself I could do that later with pencil. In the end, this is one of my favorite watercolor phases to date, despite the texture and value issues. I particularly love the soft granulation along the edge of her shadow and her hair. The first thing I did after untaping the study and propping it up was to deepen the darkest blacks. You can see how defining her lashes, filling in the brow hairs, and deepening the hairline immediately adds detail and realism. I do this first to give myself a reference. This is how dark I want to go, so everything else needs to be rendered relative to this. From there, I tested a couple combinations of colors for the shadows before deciding to go back to her hair. I like the overall shape and placement of the highlights, but I wanted more texture and depth. I achieved this by hatching along the direction of her curls and adding wispy strands along the edges to break up the silhouette. With her hair mostly finished, I moved onto the face by dotting in highlights using acrylic pen, lightening areas with white pencil, and adding warmth with orange and Indian red. Some shadows needed to be deepened, like along her jawline, while others needed to be lightened to create the illusion of bounce light, like underneath her chin. This was a slow, careful process that involved lots of stepping back to assess the overall situation. I eventually decided the shadows on her neck and chest needed to be cooler, since they were farther from the overhead warm light source. To do this, I used a combination of Derwent Smoke Blue and Olive Earth. Since these are cool tone colors, they help neutralize the warmth of the reds and oranges from the watercolor layers. When I do these studies, my primary goal is to learn more about the mediums I use, but my secondary goal is color theory through observation. Since starting this series, I've gotten better at unifying color palettes and adding hue complexity to areas like shadows. I spend as much or even more time looking at my reference compared to the actual study. I try to understand the forms shown through light and shadow and what color occurs where. It took me years to learn to see this way, and it's a skill I'll be practicing for the rest of my life. Anyway, theory aside, sometimes you just want a quick and easy win. I rewarded myself for finishing the shadow side by rendering her earring. Metal is satisfying to render because it has such strong contrast between light and dark. In one object, there's both black and white, as well as reflections of everything around it. Since I had the POSCA marker out, I used that opportunity to cover up the pencil sketch along the edge of her neck and shoulder. In the photo, what separates her body from the background isn't a line, it's the value. Her form is slightly lighter than the background, but it still blends in. To achieve this in my study, I lightened the edge, then darkened the background with smoke blue and light sienna. I followed a similar process for the red half of her shirt, but using different colors. The biggest difference, at least for me, was adding chocolate brown to the deepest folds and creases. This helped define the form better and made the highlights and midtones stand out. The white half of the shirt needed a lighter tan color that I muted down with smoke blue. I let some of the watercolor underlayer shine through along the brightest edges, since the value and color here already matched the reference. Finally, it was time for the finishing touches. This time, that meant defining the corners of her lips, finishing her nose, and adding the nose piercing with the white gel pen. Like with the earring, I had to blend the white back into the study using black. Here's the finished study. I'm happy with how I've simplified my watercolor process, and I'm eager to go forward and learn more about all the mediums I want to use. Thanks for watching, and as always, I hope you create something that brings you joy this week. I'll see you Friday with another video, for real this time. Bye!